The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events and figures discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretations of the events portrayed. This episode contains discussions of the murder of children, torture, and the abuse of power. Listener discretion is very strongly advised. Joan of Arc had a companion. You know Joan. Everybody knows Joan. The teenage girl from Domeray who heard the voice of God and led the French army to victory in Orléans in 1429, who was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, and she was then tried for heresy and witchcraft and burned at the stake at the age of 19, the Maid of Orleans, the patron saint of France, the most famous woman of the Middle Ages, and possibly of all time? Her. And her companion, the man who fought beside her and who was with her at Orléans and Patay and the siege of Paris, who was one of the greatest military commanders of the 15th century, especially in France, he is considerably less well known, and his name is Gilles de Rais. He was 25 years old when he rode beside Joan. He was brave, ferocious in battle, and apparently genuinely devoted to the cause of French liberation. He was also, at the time of Joan's death, one of the wealthiest men in the Kingdom of France. He was the heir to an enormous estate, the Lord Marshal of the French army, a man whose personal fortune was so vast that he maintained a private choir and a private chapel, and the choir had 25 members. He spent money with such spectacle, it was almost a deranged extravagance, and he managed to mostly exhaust a fortune that should have sustained him and his bloodline for centuries. And he was, in the decades following Joan's death, responsible for the abduction, torture, and murder of somewhere between 80 to 200 children. Mostly boys, mostly peasants, and mostly between the ages of 6 and 18. They were taken from the roads and the villages around his estate. He confessed to this in great detail. But the question that has occupied historians for nearly 600 years, the question that made Gilles de Rais the most genuinely complicated entry into this entire series, is whether his confession was true or not. And if it was, what made this man? And if it wasn't, what made the trial? Welcome to Dastardly Figures. I'm April Rain, and today we're going to sit with one of history's most disturbing figures and ask the question that we always ask here. What does the story really look like when we're being honest about it? Gilles de Montmorency-Lavelle was born around 1404 in the highest tier of the French aristocracy. He took the name de Rais from his maternal grandmother's estate. His father died when he was 11. His mother remarried pretty quickly after his father's death, and by all historical records, it appears that she had little further interest in her children after the remarriage. His maternal grandfather, Jean de Cron, took over his guardianship, and Jean de Cron is, in the historical record, a genuinely alarming figure. He was litigious, manipulative, and utterly amoral in his pursuit of the family's financial and political interests. And apparently, he was quite willing to deploy Gilles as an instrument of those interests from a very, very young age. At 11, he was betrothed to a wealthy heiress. The betrothal was annulled when a better prospect appeared. And then at 16, he was either married or involved in the abduction marriage of a young woman named Catherine de Thros. The historical sources disagree on whether Catherine was involved in this willingly or not, and the union was very advantageous. But whether Catherine had much say in the matter is not recorded. By the time he was in his early 20s, Gilles de Rais controlled an inheritance of staggering size. He had estates across Anjou, Patay, and Brittany, and revenues that made him one of the richest private individuals in all of France. He had more money than he had any practical use for, and he also had, by the evidence of his adult life, an almost complete absence of any type of framework on how to manage that. The military career began in the mid-1420s, in the context of the 100 Years' War. It was a long, grinding conflict between France and England over the French crown. Gilles fought. He fought well, and he rose quickly. And then, in 1429, he was placed under the command of a teenage girl from Lorraine who had claimed to hear the voices of saints. So whatever we think about Joan of Arc's voices, her military instincts were sound. The campaign that began at Orléans in 1429 and ended with the coronation of Charles VII at Reims in July was one of the most dramatic reversals in medieval military history. Gilles de Rais was part of it, and he was rewarded afterwards with the title of Marshal of France, which is one of the highest military honors that the kingdom can bestow. He was 26 years old. Joan was captured in May 1430. Gilles was not with her. He did not attempt to ransom her, and he did not, by any account, make any serious effort to save her. Whether this is because he couldn't, or because the political complications made it impossible, or because, as some historians have darkly suggested, he simply didn't, that's not clear. Joan burned in May 1431, and Gilles de Rais, by most accounts, largely withdrew from public life after that. And then, the spending began in earnest. What Gilles spent his money on tells you something about him that the trial records, for all of their sordid detail, didn't quite capture. He spent it on beauty. He spent it on elaborate theatrical productions of his own devising. He maintained an entire company of performers and commissioned plays about himself, about the siege of Orléans, and about Joan. He spent it on his private chapel, which was not just a chapel, but an entire ecclesiastical establishment. There were canons, choir boys, vestments of extraordinary quality, relics, incense, and a level of sacred theatrical production that most cathedrals couldn't match. He spent it on books. He had a genuine passion for illuminated manuscripts, for the visual and textural beauty of sacred and classical texts. He spent it on feasts, on hospitality, and on the maintenance of a household of hundreds of people who depended on his patronage. He was not spending like a man trying to acquire power or influence. He was spending like a man trying to feel something. And by the mid-1430s, the fortune was substantially depleted. So, he began selling estates, which required the approval of Charles VII, who had to issue an edict in 1435 prohibiting further sales because Gilles was liquidating his holdings so fast that the security of the surrounding territories was being threatened. When you're selling land so fast that the king has to intervene to stop you and to keep you from destabilizing regional military defenses, you are definitely not managing your finances. And so, Gilles turned to alchemy. He hired practitioners who promised to transmute base metals into gold, and he hired others who promised to summon demons who would reveal the secrets of limitless wealth. Now, the documentary record here is very complicated. There are accusations that appeared in the trial, and they were made by people under duress. But the broader pattern of desperate, grandiose, increasingly irrational attempts to reverse a financial collapse that was partially his own doing is consistent across all of those sources. And then the children began to disappear. The villages around Gilles de Rais' estate had been losing children for years. long before anyone in any position of authority had even paid any type of serious attention. The children who disappeared were almost entirely from peasant families. At the time, that was the lowest social stratum, and these were the people with the least political voice. These were families for whom a lord's displeasure could be an immediate and existential threat. When a child went missing near one of Gilles' estates, the family grieved, and some of them complained to the local authorities, but their complaints went nowhere. This is not surprising. It is devastating, but not surprising. The social structure of the 15th century in France made the complaints of peasants about the behavior of one of the greatest lords in the kingdom almost impossible to pursue. What did a village family do when they believed that their child had been taken by a man who owned their land, who commanded their local military force, and who had the ear of the king? They had no legal recourse. They had no political power. They could tell each other, and they could refuse quietly to let their children go near the roads that led to Gilles' estates. And eventually, enough of them had been warning each other for long enough that the pattern started to become visible. The specific trigger for the formal investigation was an incident in May 1440, when Gilles de Rais and his man seized a priest named Jean Le Ferron from a church in the town of Saint-Étienne de Mémoire. Le Ferron had bought the property from Gilles, one of his many desperate estate sales, and Gilles had subsequently decided that he wanted it back. The seizure of a priest from a church was a violation of ecclesiastical sanctuary, and this was a very serious offense against the church authority in a way that the disappearance of the peasant children was not. The church moved where the peasant grief could not. Jean de Melchoir, the Bishop of Nantes, opened an ecclesiastical investigation. The Duke of Brittany, Jean V., who had his own political and financial reasons to be interested in the disposition of Gilles' estates, opened a civil investigation, and the two institutes coordinated. In September of 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested, and his trial began in October. The trial of Gilles de Rais is one of the most extraordinary documents in medieval legal history. The charges, they were extensive. Heresy, apostasy, the invocation of demons, and the abduction and murder of children. The proceedings were meticulous. I know, I've read the transcripts. Gilles initially refused to enter a plea. He challenged the jurisdiction of the court, and he was threatened with excommunication, the spiritual equivalent in the 15th century of a death sentence for the soul. So he capitulated and agreed to answer the charges. His confession, when it came, was absolutely extraordinary. He confessed in detail to the abduction and murder of children over a period of approximately 8 years. He described the methods, he described the locations, and he described the involvement of his associates. 2 men named Gilles de Sille and Roger de Briqueville, and a pair of Italian sorcerers named Prelati and Patay, who had been brought in to assist with the alchemal and demonic invocation schemes. He wept during the confession. By all accounts, the weeping appeared genuine. He asked for the prayers of the parents of the victims, and he expressed apparent remorse. He was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged and burned on October the 26th, 1440, and his associates were executed right alongside him. And now I need to tell you about the problems, because there are problems. The first problem, and the most significant, is that the confession was obtained under the explicit threat of torture, and in a context where the accused understood that refusal to confess would result in both spiritual damnation and physical torment. Gilles de Rais was told very clearly what the alternative to cooperation was. And in that context, What does a confession prove? Torture and its threat produce confessions. We have been over this in the Bathory episode. We know this. And medieval jurists, they knew this too. And yet, the confession of Gilles de Rais is routinely treated as reliable evidence in a way that, if you applied it consistently, would not be accepted from other historical contexts. The second problem is that the people overseeing the trial had significant financial and political incentives to convict. Joan of Brittany stood to inherit substantial portions of the de Rais estates if Gilles was convicted of the crimes that resulted in forfeiture. The church stood to recover the ecclesiastical properties that Gilles had alienated through his sales. And the alignment of institutional interest with the outcome of the trial does not prove innocence. But it does demand that we ask hard questions about how that evidence was managed. The third problem is the number of victims. Gilles confessed to numbers that shifted across the interrogations. They ranged from about 36 to more than 100 to the estimates by the court of more than 200. No bodies were ever produced at the trial. No physical evidence was ever presented. The evidence was entirely testimonial. Confessions from the accused and his associates, as well as witness accounts from the villagers who described children disappearing. The disappearances were real. There is documentary evidence of children being reported missing in the areas around Gilles' estate over a period of many years. And that pattern is consistent enough to be troubling, even if you stripped it of the specific accusations in the trial. Something was happening. But something is happening, which is where we also landed with Elizabeth Bathory, and the detailed confession of a man threatened with torture and damnation accurately describes the full extent of what happened, are not necessarily the same thing. Most serious historians of the period do believe that Gilles de Rais did murder children. The evidence for some level of guilt is stronger with him than it was in the Bathory case. The disappearances are better documented, the geographical patterns are more consistent, the testimony of local families was more extensive, and predated the political crisis that precipitated the trial. The debate is not primarily about whether or not he was guilty, but about the scale, the specific dates, and the degree to which the trial accurately captured what occurred, versus performing the amplification of guilt that served institutional interests. I want to spend some time here on the question of what made him, or what evidence suggests made him, because this is the question that Dastardly Figures is built around, and because I think that those easy answers are not, as usual, the right answers. The popular narrative about Gilles de Rais tends towards one of two poles. The first pole is the monster narrative, the man of innate depravity who used his wealth and power to indulge urges that were simply evil. And the second is the trauma narrative. He was a child whose mother abandoned him. He was raised by a ruthless and manipulative grandfather. He was plunged into the violence of medieval warfare at a young age. And he experienced the burning of Joan of Arc as a formative catastrophe, and whose subsequent behavior was a form of psychological unraveling. Both narratives, for me at least, are way too clean. Both are doing the things that Dastardly Figures exist to push back against. They are reducing a complicated person and a complicated situation to a framework that lets us feel like we understand it. And what the evidence actually shows is this: a man who was never given adult formation, who was given almost unlimited resources and almost unlimited power over the people on his lands, who spent his fortune on beauty, theater, and sacred excess, who turned to alchemy and demonology as his financial position collapsed, and who, if the core of the accusations are true, exercised the same absolute authority over children's bodies that the feudal system granted him over every other aspect of the people's lives underneath him. The feudal system granted lords life and death power over the people who lived on their lands. It granted them legal authority to punish, to imprison, and to command. The violence that the evidence suggests Gilles directed at the children of the peasants was extreme by any measure, and it was abhorrent in its specific character. But the assumption of absolute authority over the bodies of people beneath you in the social hierarchy, that assumption was not abhorrent. The assumption was the operating condition of the world that he lived in, and he pushed it past all recognizable boundaries. But the trajectory began from a baseline that was itself already violent. This is not an excuse, and I want to be very clear about that. Nothing in those preceding statements should be read as mitigation. The children who disappeared from the villages around his estates are not footnotes in a psychological case study. They were people. And their deaths, if the core accusations were true, were a specific, catastrophic exercise of power against the most vulnerable people imaginable. But I think understanding how it happened, how a man ended up here, and what that road looks like, matters. But I think understanding how it happened, how a man ends up here, and what that road looks like, I think that matters. Not because it comforts, but because it is part of the truth. And because the comfortable story of the born monster is, as always, less accurate and less useful than the uncomfortable story of the system. Now, there is one more dimension of this story that I cannot leave without addressing. Some folklorists and literary historians have proposed that Gilles de Rais was, at least in part, the inspiration for the fairy tale of Bluebeard, the story of the nobleman who murdered his wives and keeps their bodies in a locked room. The timeline actually works. The tale appeared in French literature in the late 17th century, and it is attributed to Charles Perrault. And some scholars argue that it encodes the cultural memory of the Gilles de Rais trial. Other scholars dispute this, noting that Blackbeard variants exist in folklore traditions across cultures, and that the connections to the Gilles de Rais is speculative. What I find most interesting about this debate is not the question of whether Gilles specifically inspired Bluebeard, but the broader pattern that it points to. And it points to the way that specific historical atrocities get absorbed into myth and legend, and they lose their specific victims and their specific contexts, and their specific institutional failures. And they become, instead, a story about a single monster, a fairy tale, and a cautionary tale about not opening forbidden doors. The children who disappeared around the villages on Gilles de Rais' estates in the 1430s did not enter a fairy tale. They were people. They had families who reported them missing and were not taken seriously. And they had communities who had been warning each other for years and couldn't get the authorities to act until a priest was seized from a church. The monster is easier to understand than the system that protected him for 8 years. The monster is always easier. Gilles de Rais was hanged on October the 26th, 1440. He died with apparent equanimity, by the accounts we have anyway. He made his confession, he had been absolved, and he seemed to have believed that his soul was not, if not fully lost, that he could save a little piece of it. His estates went to the Duke of Brittany and to the church, and his name entered history as one of the archetypal villains of the medieval period. His connections to Joan of Arc, the fact that the woman France made a saint and the man France made a monster rode together into battle, is one of those historical juxtapositions that doesn't resolve into a lesson, no matter how long you look at it. But what I keep coming back to is this: that the children were dying for years. The families knew. They told each other. They tried to tell the authorities. And the machine of justice did not move until the machine of justice had a reason to enter, until there was property at stake, until there was institutional dignity at stake, and until the people who had the power to act had something to gain from the acting. The children didn't move that needle at all because their absence simply wasn't enough. Maybe he was guilty of everything. Maybe the scale was smaller than the confession described. Maybe the details were shaped by what the interrogators wanted to hear. And maybe some of what happened at his estates was different from what ended up in the trial record. What is not in question is that children disappeared, that families grieved, and that the warnings of peasants were not sufficient to produce action until a priest's sanctuary was violated. Power protects itself, and then when it can't protect itself anymore, it performs its own prosecution with great theatrical flair. And it calls itself justice. This has been the Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain. Dastardly Figures drops every week alongside the main episode and the postscript, because the monsters we remember are only ever part of the story. Stay dark.